I've been using water mixable oil paints for a few years now, and I thought I'd share some of the pros and cons of working with this unique paint, as well as answer some of the questions I've been gathering from you guys over the last couple weeks. No, I don't claim to be an expert, not even close, but I've done tons of research over the past few years as I learned to paint with oils. So I'll share everything I know, and after you watch this video, you can make your own decisions about whether you want to try it. Water mixable oil paints have been around for about 30 years, and as awareness grows and more well-known artists share their experiences on social media, the increased popularity has resulted in several brands offering their own line of these specialized paints. I mainly use 3 brands: Winsor Newton, Holbein Duo Aqua, and Jackson's line, but there are so many out there that you can try. First and foremost, the only difference between traditional oil paint and water mixable oil paint is that water mixable oil paints have a modified binder that involves an emulsifier, which just means that it can be dissolved with water. If water is not used during the process, they can be used exactly the same way as traditional oils, with all your favorite mediums such as linseed or safflower or walnut oils, your galkids, liquin, impasto gels, odorless mineral spirits, and more. But if you're like me and you have an extreme sensitivity to these mediums or poor ventilation in your studio, it becomes extremely difficult or just impossible to progress with oil painting. So for the purpose of this video, every technique I talk about will be using these paints exclusively with water or with the specially made mediums such as fast drying medium for water mixable oils. Over the years, I've experimented with everything from liquin to zest it, but I discovered that any of these additives that have an odor makes me really sick. I even remember in art school, if I walked past the painting studios, I would get this nauseous feeling, and I never really knew why, but now that I've tried all these different mediums, I realize it's because of that odor. It's because of what's in the actual products. So I've always been a bit hesitant to try oil painting, but I actually stumbled upon water mixable oils by accident when my local art shop was having a huge sale. I asked the clerk what else I would need to get started, and he said technically all I would need is water. So I was sold. So I picked up a big set of these for a pretty good deal. But young Sarah was in for a surprise. The first time I used them, I made a big mistake and I absolutely hated them. As I said, my first moments with these paints were not so successful. I made the classic mistake of jumping to conclusions based on a single experience, which in the end turned out was due to my own ignorance. I've always been more of a palette knife girl rather than a brush girl, so that first day I grabbed my palette knife, dropped some water on the paints, and tried to scoop it up with my palette knife, only to have it fall off in a big, gloopy, runny mess. It wouldn't even stick to my board, and I immediately thought that my paint was defective. Ignorance is bliss, as they say, but in this case, I was just not happy. Fast forward a few months and a couple tutorials later, and I was finally starting my oil painting journey, and this time I loved it. So as a first-time oil painter, having such a long time to mix and blend without my paint drying out was pure luxury. I was instantly hooked. Despite the normal difficulties of learning how to use a new painting medium, it still felt like I had just total freedom of expression. Being able to thin the paints down with water one moment, then scoop up some color on my palette knife and scrape it across the canvas, leaving those big, beautiful, textured strokes, felt like just pure magic. Okay, now that I've revealed how much I love them, let's talk about performance. I find that if I'm using a palette knife, the paint feels best when it's used straight out of the tube, nice and thick. If I want a little bit more flow, I can add a tiny amount of water and mix it thoroughly on my palette before applying it to the canvas. This will give it a little bit more reach, but you have to be careful not to thin it down too much, or it will feel like spreading melting butter or something across your canvas. But hey, maybe that's what you're going for. Alternatively, if I'm painting outside or like I don't need to worry about ventilation as much, I can add a medium such as the fast drying medium made specifically for water mixable oils. This thins the paint down slightly as well as speeds up the drying time, so it's more convenient. And they make a whole bunch of these mediums that do different things, but this is the one that I use most often. When using brushes, I have a slightly different preference to the consistency. Unlike palette knives, the bristles of a brush are more absorbent and can hold much more paint. So I rarely use pure paint straight out of the tube, as it tends to clog up my bristles and it won't let me spread the paint as far as I typically want to. Therefore, I will often add a teeny bit of water to thin it down as I go. I'll also clean and dry my brushes every 20 minutes or so, because I find that freshening up the bristles gives me better brush strokes. As with traditional oil paint, you have to learn how to mix and blend and apply the paint, which takes a long time, and each person will have a different process for doing that. But my typical workflow involves one big thin down wash to start the painting. This can be my base coat where I block in some of the bigger shapes to establish the composition, or even just to get rid of the white on the paper. I'll also use more of the fast drying medium during the first couple layers, which, by the way, can be used with water to thin down the paint. However, I found that you want to be careful with how much water you add if you're using the fast drying medium, because it can get a little bit too runny too quickly. As my layers progress, I'll use less and less water and more paint straight from the tube. The final layers will often be really thick palette knife application and fine detail with the brush using pure paint. In my final layers of pure paint, I'll also be able to mix in traditional oil paints when needed, but I only have a few of those specialized colors, so it's not very often for me. But I just wanted to throw that in there because yes, you can mix and match with traditional oil paints as you need, as long as you aren't using water at that point. Just a reminder, if you use anything that is not made specifically for water mixable oils, such as liquid, you won't be able to use water during the actual painting process or for cleanup. You'll have to resort to all of the traditional methods in that case. Here are a few close-ups of me working on a recent commission to show you how the consistency and flow looks during the painting process. Most of the questions I've received are about health and safety concerns related to these paints and mediums. When I paint indoors with oil paint, I will start to feel slightly dizzy or nauseous within 20 minutes. And after an hour, I have a full-on headache and my cough rate increases. So I only use oil paint outside or in my shed studio. And that includes water mixable oil paints. Not everyone has such a severe reaction and could get by with just opening their bedroom window. I know plenty of artists who use oil paint every single day for hours on end, and they even use liquid or odorless mineral spirits inside without any issues. But the point is that everyone is different. And yes, oil paint of all kind, even the water mixable ones, will slowly release fumes, sometimes almost undetectable. Odorless mineral spirits, for instance, are a perfect toxic ninja because they've been modified to smell less, but they're still releasing the fumes. So if you're breathing them in, you're probably going to experience a reaction of some kind over time. If you're one of the lucky ones who doesn't get a reaction from any of these mediums or paints, then more power to you. Ultimately, it's up to you to know your own tolerance and find ways to deal with it. Cleaning up after an oil painting session is one of the necessary evils, but luckily, with water mixable oil paint, all you really need is soap and water. The emulsifier in the binder means that water will pretty much get rid of everything on the brush or the palette. However, over the years, I've noticed that if I only clean my brush with water and let it sit for a week or so, the bristles will feel a little bit stiff and kind of oily. In my cleanup process, I always use Master's brush cleaner and preserver. I will soak my brushes in a mixture of water and the cleaner for a few hours, maybe even a day or two, and then I'll completely rinse them before laying them flat to dry. And this keeps my bristles really soft and clean over the years. I'll use a razor to scrape my palette clean and spritz it with water and a rag if I need to, but it's basically as simple as that. So these paints definitely get major points in the cleanup world. And since these are basically identical to traditional oil paints, they can be stored the same way. So you can either put them inside of a stay wet palette that seals airtight or freeze them as you would with regular oil paints. Some of my colors will stay wet for weeks and others will be dry within a few days. So I think it just depends on the brand or the pigment itself. I'm going to include some links to some useful resources for you guys down in the description below. Hopefully that will help answer any remaining questions you have, but in the next couple weeks I'm going to do an actual tutorial for painting with water mixable oils. This was more of like an informative video or intro to, and I hope it was helpful. So if you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up and, feel free to ask questions and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. Alright guys, I will see you again soon.